Welcome to the Docker for Web Developers course. Really excited about the potential that Docker offers us as web developers. Now, anytime you start with a new technology, you want to know the benefits that's going to bring to you. And we're going to start with that at the very beginning of the course. From there, we'll jump into installing Docker Toolbox on a Windows machine and Mac and learn about some of the tools like Docker Machine, VirtualBox, Linux, Docker Client, and see how we can use Docker Hub to pull down images. We'll learn about what an image is, how you can convert that into a running container, and how the layered file system plays a role behind the scenes. By the time we're done, we'll have an entire development environment set up using something called Docker Compose. And this is a really powerful technology for the development environment. And you'll see the process from start to finish of building a fully functional website. We'll then take the different services we build and move those up to the cloud using another tool called Docker Cloud, and we'll see how we can use that tool to manage the different services we may have. So we have a lot of great stuff to cover in this course. As I said, I'm really excited about the technology. So let's jump into the official agenda for the course. Docker gets a lot of attention nowadays, and for good reason. But if you've looked into it at all, you might have wondered, what exactly is it, and is it something I can actually use as a web developer? I know when I first started reading about it, hearing about it at conferences and user group talks and things like that, I really wondered if it was something that even played a role in what I did. And the more I dug in, the more I found out that, yeah, actually it can play a big role in our web development operations. And that's what we're going to address in this first module. So we're going to start off by talking about what exactly is Docker. And we'll clarify some key terms and concepts that you need to know in order to be successful to understand how Docker works and how you could use it. Now from there, we'll jump right into the benefits that Docker could provide us as web developers. And you're going to see there's actually quite a few benefits that it can provide us. There's a lot of great stuff there. Next up, we'll talk about the Docker tools and the role that they each play in this overall development workflow that we're going to be discussing throughout the course. And then we'll wrap up by seeing Docker in action. And I'll actually show an application that's using Docker to hit a database, do some caching, and some other aspects of a normal development workflow and development application. So let's go ahead and get started by answering that all-important question of what is Docker, and then jump into the benefits it can offer us as developers. Let's start things off by answering the question, what is Docker? Docker does have some different terms, so we're going to clarify what those are. We're going to clarify where it can run and how this all kind of works. So Docker itself is just a lightweight, open, secure platform. This is kind of the official party line, if you will. And the first time I heard that, it didn't make maybe a whole lot of sense because I could think of several things that might fit a lightweight, open, secure platform definition. But really what Docker is a way to simplify the process of building applications, shipping them, and then running them in different environments. Now, when I say environments, of course, I'm talking about development, staging, production, and others that you may have at work. Now, what actually ships with Docker then? Well, we're going to be talking about things called images and containers. And containers are really, really important. You'll see over the left the Docker logo. And you can think of the whale there as kind of like a ship that has containers. And back in the old days, there was no standardized way to ship things on the old school ships. So it was a lot more time intensive and not very productive to get stuff on the ship and off the ship. Whereas nowadays, the major shipping companies, of course, have very standardized size, standard height, standard width shipping containers. So as the crane goes over when the ship docks, it's very quick and efficient, very productive to get those containers on and off these ships. Well, Docker is very similar. If you think of the old days with the ships that had no standards for shipping products around, that's kind of where development has been for many years. Everybody does it their own way. Well, Docker provides a consistent way to ship our code around to different environments. And so it's going to provide a lot of benefits that we'll be talking about in this particular section of the module for us as developers. Now, it runs natively on Linux or Windows. And when I say Windows, Windows Server 2016 or higher now supports it. We'll talk more about that coming up. And as a developer, if you're on a Windows box or a Mac box or a Linux box, you can use Docker in your development workflow. And it's very easy to get up and running. Now, if you're on Mac or Windows, you will need a virtual machine because by default, it's going to expect a Windows server or a Linux server. Now, finally, the key buzzwords that are typically thrown around with Docker are images and containers. Let's clarify what exactly is an image and what is a container and how do they relate to each other. So when it comes to the role of images and containers, an image is something that's used to build a container. Now, an image will have the necessary files to run something on an operating system like Ubuntu or Windows. And then you'll have your application framework or your database and then the files that support that. So if you're doing Node.js or ASP.NET or PHP or Python, then you'd have that framework built into the image as well as your application code typically. Now, the image itself is not overly useful because it just is the definition. Think of it as the blueprint that's used to actually get a running container going. So if you go back to the shipping analogy, think of some person who does some CAD drawings of what's going to go in the shipping container, maybe even how they're going to arrange it in the shipping container. But the blueprints aren't very useful on their own, but you can use those to create an actual instance of that container. Well, that's the same process in Docker. We'll have images that can be used to create a running instance of a container. Now, containers are actually where the live application runs, or the database, or caching server, or whatever it may be that you need to actually run on a Linux or a Windows Server machine. Now, let's dive into the definitions of each of these just a little bit more. So an image is a read-only template. And what it's composed of, and we'll be building these throughout the course, is a layered file system. So you'll have some files, for instance, specific to your Linux operating system or your Windows operating system. And then you'll have your files for your framework, ASP.NET or Node.js or whatever it may be. And then they are all put together to make this image. Now, once you have an image, you can use that to build this isolated container. And again, if you go back to ships, every container is very isolated from the other containers. It makes it so you don't necessarily know what's going on in another container. Now, there are some gotchas there that we can talk about later. But in a nutshell, the image is used to create an instance of the running container. And then you can start the container, you can stop it, you can move it, you can delete it. And it starts and stops really, really fast. And that's what's so cool about this technology is it's very quick and easy to get a container on the ship and off the ship. And the ship in our case would be the development environment, the stage environment, the production environment. Now, where does Docker run then? Well, as I've already mentioned, Docker can run on Linux or Windows servers. And so if you're going to be running on a development machine, you have to have a virtual machine, which we'll talk about. Now, the exception would be if you're developing directly on a Linux machine, then you could just run Docker containers natively. But Docker ships with what's called a Docker client. And Docker client can then integrate with these different operating systems, such as Linux, and it integrates with a Docker engine, a daemon that you'll see here. Now, Docker itself has its roots in Linux. That's actually where it came out of. The Docker, the company, built on top of some LXC support, it's called, Linux container support, that's already built into the Linux operating system. Now, likewise, Windows Server 2016 or higher also has Docker support built in. And so the Docker client there could be used to integrate with the Docker engine, which can start and stop and delete and do all those things with our containers. So think of the Docker client as kind of the commands that are given to the people that load the ship or remove things off the ship, whereas the Docker engine could be the cranes and the people running those that actually get the container on the ship and up and running. Now, what's the difference between Docker containers then and virtual machines? This is one of those things that the first time I learned about this, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. So virtual machines always run on top of a host operating system. So of course you could have a host running Linux or Windows, and then you can run a guest OS on top of something called a hypervisor. And so on the left, you might have app 1, might be a PHP app, for instance, which with its binaries, libraries, whatever it may be, or ASP.NET or Node or whatever you have. And then app 2 might be running on a different guest OS. So let's say the guest OS on the left is maybe Windows, and the guest OS on the right could be Linux. The bottom line is you have a copy of the operating system for every virtual machine. And so depending on the type of hard drive and things like that, it can be a little bit expensive to start up and stop a virtual machine. They run well, but they're pretty big. The images for a virtual machine to get it up and running are generally, multiple gigabytes in size. Well, let's compare and contrast that with Docker containers. Now, they do sit still on top of a host operating system, Linux, and now most recently Windows Server 2016 or higher. And then we have this Docker engine which can integrate the containers with the host operating system. And so now, as we get a container up and running, you can think of the host operating system as the ship, and then the container for app 1 has everything app 1 needs for that particular feature. So Node.js with all the application code, for instance. Now app 2 might have a completely different container, and then typically applications will have multiple containers. You might have a container for your database, a container for a caching piece, a container for your application code and the framework, those type of things. But the bottom line is they sit right on top of the native operating system. So when I ship these around, I'm shipping a smaller image. It's very small compared to a guest OS virtual machine. They also containers also start very, very fast. And we'll be seeing that throughout the course. They're great. They just come up in a matter of seconds. The difference here is very, very big. Containers sit on top of the host, whereas guest OSs and VMs sit on top of the actual host, but they're their own copy of all the files. Everything is a copy as you make a new VM. So that's an example of what Docker is. We've now talked about images and containers, and we'll be delving much, much more into those throughout the course. And then we've also done a comparison between Docker containers and virtual machines. So now that we've done that, let's start talking about, all right, this is great and all, but how does this actually help me as a web developer? Docker offers several different benefits to us as web developers, and in this section we're going to walk through some of the key benefits that we can get by leveraging it. So whether you work on a team of one or many, Docker can help set up a development environment very quickly, and that's really one of the key aspects that we're going to focus on throughout this course. Although that's just a very minor benefit, it's definitely a big benefit as a web developer. Docker can also help eliminate app conflicts. If you have versions of frameworks and you can't move to the latest version, isolated containers can help out there. It also provides a way to move your code and the entire environment of the code between your different environments, so between things like development, staging, and production. And if we can do all of that, we can more than likely ship software faster, and that's a good thing, of course. So let's dive into each of these 4 areas really quickly. So when it comes to accelerating developer onboarding, oftentimes we have multiple team members, of course, and we might have some developers, maybe a mix of designers, or people that kind of do both of those things. And oftentimes you want people working with the actual version of the app versus just a prototype that's separate. And so we might have a web server, we might have a database server, caching server, and those types of things. And setting all that up on an individual developer machine, especially for people that work remotely in different scenarios, can be challenging because you have to get the security right, you have to get the configuration settings right, make sure the right versions are on there. And so getting that right and not having surprises after the fact can be a little bit challenging. So Docker can help there because we can make one or more images that can then be converted into running containers. And those containers can run on our different developer and even designer machines. You'll see in just a little bit, to get this up and running, you can just run a simple command from the command prompt. So you really don't even have to be a developer per se to get some of the benefits out of what Docker can offer here. Now, the next thing we'll talk about that Docker can help us with is eliminating app conflicts and version conflicts. Oftentimes you have an app running on a specific version of a framework, and you'd like to move to the next version of the framework, but you're told you can't because that'll impact other applications running on the production servers. And so what Docker can offer is isolated containers, and each container that actually contains the framework that's having this versioning can actually be isolated, as we've talked about. And as a result, we can have V1 and app 1, 2, and 3 that are targeting V1 will run fine in their own containers. And then app 1, 2, and 3 targeting V2 can run in their own containers. And now we can have different versions of whether it's Node or PHP or ASP.NET running. This makes it a lot easier now to work with versioning and app conflicts. Now, some of the frameworks out there obviously have some of this versioning built in, but with this, you really won't have to worry about it, even if your framework doesn't have a good versioning story as you move between versions. Docker can help out in those scenarios. Now, it can also help, as mentioned, with consistency between environments. And this is one of those things that I know I personally have been burnt by over the years. Going way back, around the year 2000, we had a particular project I was working on at a consulting company, And our development environment was set up by the company. We didn't actually do it ourselves, so we had to work on remote machines. And the staging environment was also set up by them. And everything was working great on dev. And it was supposed to be the same as staging, but turns out it was not. And so we had a nice surprise and had to do some rewrites of things as we moved our first code over to staging. With Docker, we can eliminate a lot of these surprises because we'll simply move the different images that we're going to be building throughout this course over to the different environments and get the containers up and running. And that way, if it runs on dev, it definitely should run the same on staging and production. And we'll talk about how to get all that set up. Now, when doing that, that just means obviously we can leverage all of these benefits to ship code faster. And that's really what software is all about, is productivity, high quality, predictability, consistency, all these different words we can throw out. But as we do move our images between dev and staging and production and get those containers going, we can leverage these benefits that Docker offers of the isolation of the containers. We can have a consistent development environment and all the other benefits with versioning and things that we've talked about. So there really is a lot of good things that Docker brings to the table for us as web developers. Now that you've seen what Docker is and some of the benefits that can offer us as web developers, let's jump in really quickly to some of the Docker tools that we're going to be talking about and actually installing a little later in the course. So Docker has a Docker Toolbox that you can actually download from this URL shown here. And so if you go to docker.com, we'll be talking about some of the documentation, and they have some really nice docs on installing Docker and getting these tools I'm going to show you all going on your machine. It's actually very simple to do, but we'll do that in a future module in the course. Now, Docker Toolbox itself allows us to do a lot of the things that you'll want to do with images and containers. So for instance, I can build images and I can then run an image as a container, and I can do all the configuration. I can get the logs of a container, for instance. I can specify ports to use and much, much more that we'll talk about. Now, it is going to require a virtual machine. By default, it uses VirtualBox, and it's going to get all that installed actually for you out of the box. You don't even have to really do much on your part. So if you're on Windows or Mac, you will need to have VirtualBox, but the Docker Toolbox will provide that for you. And then this runs anywhere you want. So you can run Docker itself, and this, when I say Docker, that's actually kind of a generic term for the Docker Toolbox. You can run a lot of the tools that are provided, such as the Docker client that we talked about earlier, the Docker engine, and all of that on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And again, if you're on Linux, it has the container support, and you can just run it like on Ubuntu, for instance, directly. So what tools do you actually get in this toolbox? Well, we're going to get all the key things we need. So we're going to get the Docker client, and this is how we're going to be able to interact and view our images, our containers, and we can start and stop containers, do all that type of stuff. Docker Machine is going to allow you to work with the virtual machine and set up environment variables and other things that we'll need so that Docker Client can then interact with the different running containers that you might have or that you might want to start. Docker Compose is going to allow us to run multiple containers. So an application typically isn't just a web server. We oftentimes have our database and other types of application servers potentially. So Docker Compose will allow us to set up a really simple way to bring up multiple containers and have those containers talk to each other. And then if you're kind of either anti-command line or just would prefer to have a GUI, then Docker Kitematic, which is a bit of a newer part of the Docker Toolbox, allows you to actually locate Docker images that are out there. When you go to docker.com, you can also get to something called the Docker Hub. And this is where we can actually host images that we might create, or we can actually grab images that other people create. So for instance, if you want to run ASP.NET or Node.js or PHP or whatever it may be, those images are already up there. And then of course you can always tweak those images if you want to do your own little tweaks. So Docker Kitematic allows us to view the different images that are out there. We can then bring those down locally, convert them into containers, interact with those containers, and do a lot of the stuff that would normally be done through the command line, more through a GUI type of tool. And I mentioned that VirtualBox is going to be used to host these different containers that we're going to be running. And this is something we'll have to run again if you're on just a regular Windows machine or on a Mac. Now, in the upcoming modules in the course, I'm going to show you how to get all this installed, and we'll actually start using specific commands from a lot of these tools, and I'll show you how these can fit into our web development workflow. In this module, we're going to take a look at the process for setting up Docker Toolbox on your development machine and getting a development environment all set up and running. So I'm going to start off by introducing the process of installing Docker Toolbox on a Mac, and then I'll show the same process on a Windows machine. Now you're going to see, regardless if you're running on Mac or Windows, it's actually a very simple process, and you can have Docker Toolbox installed and up and running in a matter of minutes. Really easy to get started with. Now, once we get it installed, we're going to kind of validate, did it work and can we actually use it? So I'm going to introduce a visual tool that's part of the toolbox called Docker Kitematic. And this is a tool that lets us search for images that are already out there up in the cloud. They're up on a site called Docker Hub. And we're going to pull those images down and then get some running containers going. So I'll show you how to get started with Kitematic and what it is. Then I'll show you an actual example of pulling some images off of Docker Hub and getting those up and running without really having to know anything at all about VirtualBox or command line or anything. Now later in the course, we'll dive into other tools in the toolbox, but we're going to focus mainly on getting it installed in your development environment in this particular module. Let's take a look at the process for getting Docker Toolbox installed on a Mac. So you can start off by going to docker.com. And we could go through the docs and find the installation information, but they have this more obvious getting started with Docker. And from here, it'll take us to the default of Mac OS X. We can read up a little bit about what this is going to offer and what we can do with Docker. And if we go down to the bottom here, you can go to the next page to install the toolbox. Now this has all the information about what's in Docker Toolbox, as you'll see here. And if we scroll on down, you can get some minimum version information, and then we can get down to actually installing Docker Toolbox. So we'll click here and this will take us right to the actual Docker Toolbox homepage. And you'll see that I can install for Mac and for Windows. So I'm going to go ahead and start the download for Mac, and this will take a little bit of time, so we'll come back and finish this. Through the magic of video, we'll speed up the process. Now that we have Docker Toolbox downloaded, we can go through the process of getting it installed. So it's going to prompt us to see if we want to go ahead and do this. I'll say yep. Now the version will certainly change. It changes fairly frequently actually, but there's the version as of today, and then we can hit continue. Now this will show you everything it's going to install. So you'll notice Docker Client, Docker Machine, Docker Compose, Kitematic, and a Quick Start Terminal app. And we're going to be covering all of these in the class and the different modules. We'll go ahead and leave the default here, hit continue, and install. And this will prompt you to enter your password normally. So we'll get that, and it's a pretty quick process overall. All right, so it looks like it's all installed, and you'll notice that we have access to this Quick Start Terminal and this Kitematic, and we'll cover those a little bit later. But these can be found in our applications area. So I'm going to hit continue here. Looks like we're all done. We'll close, and let me run off to Finder, and I'm already in applications, and you'll see that there's a Docker entry right here. And there's the Quick Start Terminal. We're going to be using that a lot throughout the class. And there's this Kitematic. We're also going to be talking about the basics of that particular app. And so the Quick Start Terminal is really where we're going to spend most of our time in the class. And I'm going to walk through a lot of different commands that you're going to be able to run there. But that's how easy it is to get Docker Toolbox up and running on your Mac. As with a Mac, installing Docker Toolbox on Windows is as simple as walking through an installation wizard. So I'll show you how we can find that, download it, and get it running. So the first thing, again, you'll want to do is run off to docker.com. So if you saw the Mac installation process in the previous clip, you'll have already seen this. But if not, you can go to the docs to get to the installation information there. You can click on Get Started with Docker here, which I'm going to do, or you'll even see a Get Started up here. So they make it pretty obvious on how to find information about it. So go ahead and click on Get Started with Docker. Now, this will take you right to the Mac docs, but from here we can click on Linux or Windows. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Windows version. You can read through those, but really all we have to do is click on Next Page to install, and it'll have some information about the version of Windows that's required. And you can see it's Windows 7 or higher. So scrolling on down, you'll find some additional information, and one of the things I want to point out is the virtualization enabled. You will have to have virtualization enabled. This is something that typically you enable through your BIOS. Not something I'll be showing here, but you do need to make sure that your version of the BIOS and your Windows installation has hardware virtualization installed and up and running. So just as a heads up there, if you don't have that, it won't work right. So moving on down, we can go to the Install Docker Toolbox and go right to the Docker Toolbox link. So let's go ahead and click on that. And now I simply need to download it. Now this will take a moment to download, so I'll pause here, and then we'll come back once it's downloaded. So now that the file's downloaded, we can simply click on the executable, and this will pop up the installation wizard. And now it's really just a matter of walking through the wizard. I think we're all pretty good at this on Windows machines. So if you'd like to help them improve the installation process, you can do that. But I'm going to hit next. Default location you'll see is in the standard program files. I'm going to go ahead and leave that. And now it's going to ask me what I want to install. Now I'm going to go ahead and go with the full installation. And I would actually recommend that if you're first getting started with Docker. It may be that you don't need certain things, for instance, Kitematic. Git for Windows you may or may not want, but I'm going to go ahead and leave all of these because these are things I typically will be using. So we'll go ahead and hit next. And I'm also going to leave the defaults here. This is going to add some desktop icons to get to the Docker terminal. It'll also add your Docker binaries into your path so you don't manually have to know where things are located on your hard drive. And then this upgrade boot to Docker VM, this is for if you already have a version of Docker installed, the virtual machine we're going to have to run in order to get to Linux is going to automatically be upgraded for us if we leave this. So I would recommend leaving that, especially in this example, because we don't have anything on this machine. So go ahead and hit next and install, and this will walk us through the process now and get everything that we need on our machine. And it looks like the setup process has completed. So if I click finish, this will actually show me the different icons that's installed. It's very similar to what you'll see on a Mac. You get to the Docker Quick Start terminal and to this GUI tool called Kitematic. So now we're all set up and running. We can come on in. If I type Docker, we should be able to get into the Docker commands here as well, you'll notice. Makes it very, very easy to get to things, and we'll start to use these tools coming up in later sections of this module. Now that we have the Docker Toolbox installed, let's take a look at some of the different tools that we can use to work with images, containers, and things like VirtualBox. So the first one we're going to talk about is called Docker Kitematic. And this is a GUI-based tool that allows you to interact if you're on Mac or Windows with VirtualBox without really knowing anything about it. And you can also work with images and containers. Now this includes visually searching up on something called Docker Hub, which I'll show you in a moment, for Docker images that other people have already published. And then once you find an image, you can bring it down to your local machine and actually create, run, and then manage containers based on those different images. So let's take a look at an example of what this Kitematic tool looks like. Now earlier you saw that when we install Docker Toolbox, we get access to a Quick Start terminal and to Kitematic. Now we're going to learn more about the Quick Start terminal and different commands you can run later in the course, but for now, let's focus in on Kitematic and see what it can do, and also how it can be used to make sure that our Docker Toolbox is installed and running properly. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up, and this will take me to a screen where I can log in to something called Docker Hub. Now Docker Hub is a cloud-based repository of images that other people have put up on the web so that we can leverage those. Now the images I'm going to show you are public, but it is possible to have private images as well that only you can get to. Now normally what you'll have to do initially, if you haven't signed up already, is click on sign up, of course, and then you'd have to register. Very quick process. But I already have an account, so we'll go ahead and log in, and this will take me to the search screen where I can now download different images that people have made, run those as containers in my Docker on my local client in my development environment, and then work with these very easily without really knowing anything at all about the command line or VirtualBox or any of these things that we need for the development environment. So you'll notice on the left, I have a list for containers. I currently don't have any, but if we had any containers that maybe are already running or just that are installed but not running, we could control those here. You'll see that change in just a moment. And then over here on the right, we have the images from Docker Hub that we can download to our local development machine. Now, if I were to click on one of the kind of ... type things here, the ellipsis, you'll notice that I can view on Docker Hub. So let me show you what this looks like really quickly. This takes me up to the hub.docker.com, where I could also sign in, and shows me the commands I could run, including this command called pull, which we'll talk about later. But I have some comments about it and how it can be used and things like that. So we could come up to search. Let's say we wanted to find a WordPress Docker image. Well, here's the official WordPress image. And there's some information about the versions, other things that support it, what's not supported, all that good stuff here. So there's a lot of info, and then here's the command we could run to actually get this. But with Kitematic, I could get this and other images on my local machine very, very quickly and easily. So I'm going to start off by just showing a really simple hello world example. So I'm going to come up to the search. We're going to type hello world, and we found this Nginx again. This is a reverse proxy type of server. We'll actually be using this later in the course. But I'm going to go to the really, really basic hello world image. So we could view this on Docker Hub. We can get a little bit of information about what it is. Here's the example output of what we should see when we run it. It's a very, very simple type of image. And there's a command again that you can run if you want to use the command line. Now for us though, since we're in Kitematic right now, I can simply click on create. That's now going to download that image. And now it's going to go ahead and allow me to run it. I can start that container now. So if you remember, we have images which serve as the foundation for containers. So I'm going to go ahead and hit start, and you'll notice that we now get some nice output because this container started up, spit out this output to the log, and then it shut down. You'll notice it stopped up here. So we could go, again, get more information by clicking here. We can get to any settings. This one doesn't really have much. We can delete the container this way, or I can come over here and remove it as well. But this allows me to now interact with my containers in a very, very simple way without knowing anything at all about the command line. Now, throughout the rest of the course, we're really not going to be using Kitematic that much, but I like to show it because, number one, it's a quick and easy way to see if your Docker Toolbox is up and running and everything's working as we would expect. But it's also a very quick and easy way to get started if you don't want to use the command line, because you don't have to. You could actually do it right here. Now, if I was done with this, I can click here and it'll say, do you want to stop and remove it? It's already stopped. So I'll go ahead and say, yeah, let's go ahead and remove it. And we'll be back to our search. Now, if I wanted to get the Nginx one going, I could, of course, click on create. This will give me some information once it downloads. You'll see the download coming down here. It just now created the container and we're off and running now. And now we have an actual container that's running. You'll notice this one is not quite as simple as the hello world that just spit out some log information and then stopped. This container is now up and running. And you'll notice there's even a preview over here to the right of the actual container itself. And it gives you some information about what you can do to interact with it if you wanted. There's a little website files you could even interact with. But this actually shows us a little preview. If I click on this, I can actually view this live container in my browser. Doesn't really show you a whole lot, but it does show that this is actually working. There's our IP address, and it came up with a port that it used to run this. Now, if I'm done with it, I can hit stop. That'll now stop the container. And then once that container's stopped, I can just click here and say remove. And now we're back to where we were. And that's how easy it is to locate an image, download it onto your machine, and then run that image. And then again, if you want more details, you can always go into this and go to the Docker Hub, or you can view the documentation once the image has already been installed. Now there's even more you could do with this. This will let you get to all of the images up there, but since I'm logged in, if I had anything in my local repository up in Docker Hub, you can have a private repository, then I could get to those images as well. So that's an example of what Kitematic will allow us to do. Now on the Windows side, it works the same exact way. Here's an example of Kitematic running on Windows. I've already logged in. I even found the Hello World image, and we can now come down to that really simple one. We can create it. That's going to run it locally after it downloads. You'll notice it's downloading right now. It stopped because it just runs the output, and then we're done. And likewise, I can now remove it. A little bit different looking, but same general premise. And now that's gone. And then same thing for the Nginx. So whether you're on a Mac or you're on Windows, you're going to get the same type of behavior, the same interface. So it's very easy to get started with Kitematic, and that's why I like to start with it initially, especially for those that are new to images and containers, because this kind of takes all the complexity out and lets you interact with images and containers visually. Now coming up, we're going to switch gears to some of the Toolbox command line tools that we can run, but I hope you now have a good idea about what Kitematic can do. In this module, we're going to take a look at specific tools in the Docker Toolbox, including Docker Machine and Docker Client, and we're going to see how we can run these across different operating systems. Now we're going to start off by talking about Docker Machine and how it can be used to interact with VirtualBox on Windows or Mac and interact with the actual machine that's running Linux in this case. Now from there we're going to take a look at Docker Machine in action on Mac and then on Windows. Now I'm going to show both operating systems. In fact, I'm going to show the commands twice, once on Mac and then again on Windows. And there's a little bit of a method to the madness there. Number one, you're going to be able to see the commands on your chosen operating system. But number two, if you do want to watch both, the one for Mac and then the one for Windows, then this is going to help reinforce the commands and hopefully help give you a better grasp of what you can do with these commands and how they're used. Now, once we cover Docker Machine, we're going to take a look at the Docker Client tool, introduce that, and then we'll do the same thing. I'll show several commands you can use that are the key commands for a Mac, and then we'll also show for Windows. And then we'll do a wrap up and discuss what are the Docker commands again so that you can hopefully remember these even better and we'll cement your knowledge a little bit. Now, as a quick review, Docker Toolbox has several different tools in it. We're going to cover just a few of those here. So we're going to cover Docker Client as mentioned and Docker Machine, but there are some other tools that we'll cover later in the course. Docker Compose is one of those. We've already taken a look at Docker Kitematic. And then we're going to see that although VirtualBox plays a behind-the-scenes role on Mac and Windows, Docker Machine is going to help us interact with that and actually work with VirtualBox machines. So let's get started by talking about Docker Machine and how it can be used and some of the different commands that can be run in your development environment. Let's take a look at another tool in the Docker Toolbox called Docker Machine. Now, Docker Machine can be used to create and manage your local machines that you're going to be working, for instance, on your development environment machine. It can also be used to create and manage different cloud machines, such as ones on AWS or Azure or other cloud-based providers. But we're going to mainly be using it to manage our local machines. Now, as mentioned, if you're on Mac or Windows, you are going to have VirtualBox because Docker out of the box is either going to be running when the Docker containers run, I should say, on either Linux or on a Windows server. Now we're going to mainly leverage the Linux features here. And so for us to interact with that, we need a way to host it. And that, of course, is what VirtualBox does. And so Docker Machine will let us start and stop and create different virtual machine images. Now, it can also configure the environment so that when you pull up a command line bash type shell in Windows or in Mac, that you can use the Docker commands to manage your images, start and stop your containers, and perform those types of operations. Now, there's a few commands that we need to know to get started, and I'm just going to show you a quick list of a few of the key commands. These are not things you need to memorize because I'm going to be using these throughout the course, but they are good to know. So one of the commands is called Docker Machine ls. Now, Docker Machine is the actual command line tool, and then ls is the command we're going to run. So this would list all of the different machines that we can issue Docker commands against. Now, what do I mean by machine? Well, out of the box, you're going to see in a moment that when you install Docker, you're going to get one VirtualBox machine set up called default. Now, you can certainly set up others, but when you first get started, one is good enough. And so we'll have default, and we can use Docker Machine to list that and any others that you might create. That's what the ls command does. Now, we can also start and stop our virtual machines. And so Docker Machine start, and then machine name would be whatever it is. As mentioned, default is the default name of the machine. So we can use the start command, or we can use the stop command. And that's how you can easily start and stop one of the VirtualBox images on Mac or Windows if you'd like. We can also configure the environment for a machine. This is really important, and I'll be showing this in just a moment. But when you first pull up a command line terminal window, you're going to want to issue some Docker commands to manage your images, your containers, and things like that. And you first need to make sure that Docker knows what machine it's going to be interacting with during that terminal session. So you'll see in a moment, I'm going to use Docker Machine environment command to do that. Now we can also get the IP address of a given machine. And that's useful as we start to test our containers that are running. For instance, we might pull up a browser and want to call into the machine and call a specific container. And we'll be demonstrating that as we move along as well throughout the course. So these are some of the key commands that you can use for Docker Machine. There are certainly others, but these are the ones you need to know to get started. So let's take a look at an example of some of these commands in action. Once we have Docker Toolbox installed, we can get directly to the Kitematic tool that I showed earlier, but we can also get to the Docker Quick Start terminal. And this is a terminal window, a command line window that you can get to interact with Docker tools, such as Docker Machine. Now, what I normally do is drag and drop this down to my dock, and you'll see I already have it here. And the first time this fires up, if your virtual machine is not running, your VirtualBox machine that Docker Toolbox installs, then it's going to go ahead and run a machine. It's going to give it a name of default. You'll see that right here, and it's going to take a moment to start this machine up. Now from here, it's going to copy over some certificates and do some other configuration, and once you get to the nice little whale image, you'll know that Docker's now configured as it says to use this machine called default, and it even gives you the IP address of the machine that VirtualBox is actually hosting. So what is default? Well, default is our VirtualBox Linux machine that we're actually going to be issuing Docker commands against. But before we do that, the first thing you want to do is make sure that your terminal window is linked up to the proper machine. Now ours obviously is, because I have my default machine is all wired up here, it says. And once that's done, we can start working with these machines and using them. So one of the key things you'll want to know about is things like the IP address. And you'll see that, yeah, you can see it here, but as you start issuing commands, or maybe you type clear and clear it all out, you might forget what that is. So there's a couple ways we can get the IP address of the running machine that is hosting our Linux server in this case. And one of those is we can say docker machine ls. And the ls command will automatically let us know all the machines that are running on this particular box on my development machine. Looks like I have one called default. It's running through VirtualBox, it's up and running, and there's the IP you can see. If I just wanted to get the IP address though, I could say Docker machine IP for the name of the machine. Now you would have to know the name by default, it's called default, but you can create other machines as well. Now we're not gonna do that, we'll just use the default machine in this course, but it is possible to create others. So I'm gonna hit enter, and you'll notice I can get the IP address. Now, likewise, if I just want to get the status, you'll see the state, which is running. And if I want to get it for a particular machine, we can say Docker machine, get me the status for default. And it's up and running. Now, from here, I can also start and stop machines. Now, this one is obviously already started, but we could say Docker machine stop default. And this will take a moment to run, but this will actually shut down the running virtual machine. And typically, if I'm not using Docker on a particular day, I will shut it down. You'll see it was pretty quick to do this. So that'll free up some memory on your machine if you happen to need it. But a lot of the time, I'll just leave it up because I'm jumping in and out of Docker throughout the day when I'm on a particular development project. Now we can also say Docker machine start default, and this will now start the machine back up. Now, once again, when you run the quick start terminal, if it's not already started up, it'll start it up for us. So kind of don't have to use the start as much, but every now and then you might shut it down yourself and then want to manually restart it. Now, while this is running, I'm going to go ahead and open up just a regular command terminal window here. All right, so I already have my running Docker machine one, but I'm going to do just a new window. Now, because I didn't use the quick start terminal, it didn't run any of the early shell scripts that kick us into the world of Docker. I'm just in normal terminal mode. In fact, let me just make this a little bigger so we don't get confused by the one in the background. And now let's go ahead and try to do something like Docker machine IP of default. And you'll notice I can get to that, but if I start to run commands, and we'll learn about some of these Docker client commands a little later in this module, but I'm going to do one called Docker PS, and you'll notice I get an error. Cannot connect to the Docker daemon. Is the Docker daemon running on this host? And you might, first time you see this, do what I did and go, well, wait a sec, I know the virtual machine's running, so what's the problem here? Well, if you go through the quick start terminal, you probably won't have to do this, but if you want to either A, configure a different terminal to use the default machine so that you can issue Docker commands against it, such as this PS. PS would list all of our containers, by the way, but we'll learn about that coming up. Or B, we might want to hook this terminal up to a different machine other than default. What we can do is wire up this terminal to the machine that we want to issue Docker commands against. And the way we can do that is through another command called docker machine env. And then if I just do this, we'll get an error, but we have to tell it the machine name. So we'll say default. And what this will do is add some, you'll see kind of variables here into our environment variables. And then it's going to say, run this command to configure your shell. Now, when we ran the quick start terminal, it's already doing this behind the scenes to hook us up to the default, because that's the one you get out of the box. But if I wanted to either hook up to a different machine, then I could have said Docker machine environment, whatever that other machine is, my machine maybe. And then what you have to do is run this eval command. So you literally just copy this, paste it down, and then run that. And now when I run Docker show me all the containers, which is a PS command, you'll notice that at least it works. Now I don't have any, we'll be doing that shortly. So that's a really, really nice tip that I know I struggled with initially when I got into Docker, because I didn't realize that you had to hook up the terminal window, if you didn't use the Docker Quick Start terminal anyway, to the actual machine that you want to issue the commands against. That's a quick look at the Docker env command as well. All right, so now we've seen several of the commands. You can actually list all of them by saying Docker machine and just hit enter. And this will list all of the different commands that we have available. And you'll see there's quite a list here. A lot of stuff you can do, but we're now kind of going over the key ones: the environment command, the IP, the status, the ls, the start and the stop. You can even restart a machine. Very similar, just Docker machine restart default. And there's even ways you can create new machines. If you wanted to have different versions of Linux or something like that running, then potentially you could create a different machine if you'd like. So that's a look at some of the key Docker commands that you can run that are specific to Docker machine. And again, Docker machine is part of the Docker Toolbox that we've already installed, and now we have that up and running, and we can now interact with that machine. And that's what it looks like from a Mac standpoint. Whether you're working on a Mac or on Windows, you can run the same exact Docker machine commands. In fact, you'll run a bash shell even if you're on Windows, as you'll see in a moment. Now, we've already installed the Docker Toolbox, so it added some icons on my desktop area. What I like to do is drag down the Docker Quick Start terminal down to my toolbar. So I'm gonna go ahead and open that up. And you can see that it automatically fires up the virtual machine called default. This is running as a Linux virtual machine in VirtualBox and gives me the IP address. Now, one of the things that's a little bit different though on the Windows side is that you'll note that I'm not in a normal DOS mode here. I'm in a type of bash shell. And so I can run commands, for instance, like ls, which would be very similar to dir that you're used to in Windows. And that'll list where I'm at, all the files and folders and things. I can type clear, kind of like CLS in Windows. And notice that clears off the screen. And there's a lot of other things we could do that are related to more of a bash environment. So what this does is it installs this bash environment for Windows, and that's a good thing actually, because the same commands that we can run on Mac and Linux, you can run here on Windows. So let's get started by jumping into the Docker machine command itself. Earlier when I pulled this up, you saw that we had a Docker machine called default, and again it listed the IP. And so I can list all the machines on my Windows environment by saying Docker machine ls. And this will now list that I have a machine called default. It's running on VirtualBox. The status is it's up and running. And there's the IP address you can see for that machine. Now, if I wanted to get to the IP on Windows for that particular machine, we could say Docker machine IP for the name of the machine. So you simply take that name there, hit enter, and there we go. And I could also get the status by doing Docker machine status for default. And you can see it's up and running. So ls will get you all the machines, but if you just want to get a particular property of that machine, such as the IP or the status, then you can run those commands as well. Now, when we ran the Quick Start terminal, this actually ran some behind-the-scenes scripts that made it possible to run other Docker commands against this machine called default. And one of the commands we're going to learn about later is Docker PS. Now, if you watched all of this for the Mac side of it, this is going to look exactly the same, and that's kind of the point of it. But if you are just jumping right to this Windows information, Docker PS will list the running containers that we have. And we'll talk more about this coming up later in the module. But you'll notice that it works. All right, and the reason this works is because when I did the Quick Start terminal, it already made sure that my default virtual machine was running. If it wasn't, it starts it up. And it hooks this terminal window here to that running machine so that when I issue commands, many of which we'll learn about a little bit later here in this module, such as Docker PS, those commands work. If we weren't linked to the machine, then we'd have some problems and we couldn't run the commands. Now, one way you can switch machines or link it up yourself is you can run docker machine env for the name of the machine that you want to hook to. And what this will do is it'll set up some environment variables for us. You'll see those there. And then it tells me, go ahead and run this eval statement. Now you'll notice there's a space here. And so unfortunately, if you run it as they sort of show you, let me just copy that down. We'll paste that. We're going to get an error because of the space. It didn't know what to do. Now, we could just kind of abbreviate this and run docker machine directly because it is a known command. You've already seen that up here. But if we want to leave what they give us and just fix it up, I'm going to hit home to go to the beginning. And I'm just going to add a single apostrophe, and we're going to wrap this path. Let me do end, and we'll kind of back it in here. All right, now it'll know that we have some spaces in our path in this case, in our folders. And now it's going to work appropriately. Now, we were already hooked into default, so that was a very redundant thing to do, but it's good to know, because if you ever, for whatever reason, want to switch to a different machine, you'll have to set the Docker environment to something other than default. Maybe my machine, if that's what it was called. All right, so the last thing is if you want to see all the commands Docker machine has, you can say Docker machine, and this will list everything you can do. So you'll see there's quite a few commands here. We can go in, and in fact, I'm going to show a start and a stop to wrap up, but we can start a machine, we can stop a machine. I've shown you the status, the LS, and the IP. But there's a lot of other things you can do. You can actually create new machines. We're not going to do that because the default machine has everything we need for now. But there's a lot of information you can inspect and kill a machine and do all kinds of fun stuff. We're focusing right now on the key commands that you need to know to get started here. The last thing I want to show you is that you can also come in and say Docker machine start or stop. Obviously, default is already started. We've seen the LS and we can see it's running. But I could also come in and say Docker machine stop default. And now that's going to stop that virtual machine. And then likewise, I could say Docker machine start default, and there's even a restart. So let's go in, and now that that one is stopped, which is pretty quick, you could see, we can start default. And this will take just a little bit more time to start it back up, but then we'll have a running virtual machine again, and we'll be kind of ready to go. Now, if when you start a machine, if for some reason, when you issue Docker commands, you get an error, then you'll need to run that Docker environment, the env command that I showed, and then do that eval, copy and paste thing. So that's an example of how you can run Docker machine commands on a Windows environment. And again, if you happen to watch the earlier one on how to do this on a Mac, you should now see that the commands are the same, which is really, really nice. It doesn't matter what you're on, Linux, Windows, Mac, you're going to be running the same exact commands. And so once you learn these core commands that I'm going to focus on here, you're pretty much good to go, regardless of what operating system you're going to be running against. Once you have your Docker machine set up using the Docker machine tool, you can then start working with Docker images and containers through the command line using the Docker client. Now, the Docker client really is a tool that interacts with something called the Docker daemon. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but you can think of the Docker daemon as the engine that ultimately can control accessing our containers that are running. Well, the Docker client will let us work with images and then convert those images into running containers. And so we're going to look at some of the different commands that you can use with this particular tool. As mentioned, this tool, Docker client, is going to allow us to interact with the Docker engine, the Docker daemon that's running behind the scenes. Through using this tool, we can build and manage images. We can then take those images and run and manage containers. And all of this will be running on Linux for these particular demos. And we'll be using VirtualBox again, either on Mac or on Windows. So let's look at some of the commands that you could use as you start to work with the Docker client. Now, some of the key commands are going to be shown here, and this is a small subset of the commands. There are quite a few that you can run. One of the big ones you'll use, though, is called Docker pull. You might find a Node.js image or a ASP.NET or PHP or whatever it may be. You might have an image up in Docker Hub, and you want to pull that from Docker Hub down to your development environment. Well, we can use the Docker pull command to do that. Once we have an image, we can run it. We can use Docker run to do that. We simply say Docker run and then give it the name of the image that we want to run. We can also list all of our images by simply running Docker images. And then when it comes to containers, we can run docker ps, and this will list all of the different containers that we might have available. Now, once you have the containers and the images and everything available, we can then start containers, we can stop containers, and do all kinds of things that we're going to look at throughout the course. And so before we go too far though, let's take a look at using the Docker client with these commands and see how they can interact with our different images and containers that we may have or that we might want to grab from Docker Hub. Let's take a look at some of the commands we can issue using the Docker client tool that's available in the Docker Toolbox. So the first thing I'm going to do is just type the word Docker. And if I just hit enter or return here, this is going to show all the different commands. And you'll notice there's quite a few commands. Now we're only going to focus on just the essentials that we need to get started. But those are the commands you can use. And there's a lot you can do with images and containers and a bunch of other stuff as well. Now from here, let's learn how we can pull an image off of Docker Hub. And we talked about Docker Hub a little bit earlier. And if you go to hub.docker.com, you can get to it. Now you can certainly log in and create an account and all that, but if we just come up to the search, I'm going to type hello world, and this will pull up the hello world image. And we'll click on it, and you'll notice there's this Docker client pull command that we can issue. So I can actually just copy that from here, get information if I'd like to read up on it, but we'll go on back, and I can just paste this in. So let me clear this, and we'll just paste Docker pull and then name of the image. Now this is going to pull down the layered file system, it's called. This is the actual image itself, very small you can see. And so now I have this image locally, but how do we know if it's really there? Did it work? Well, the second command we're going to look at for Docker client is we can type the Docker client tool again, and now I can say images. And what this will do is list all the images that I have installed. And it looks like we now have one image. Let me make this just a little bit bigger. You can see it's hello world. We have the latest. It assigns a unique ID to it. And it looks like it was created 11 weeks ago, and it's very small, 960 bytes. Now that's how easy it is to first off pull an image off of Docker Hub and then actually see what images do we actually have. Now I've mentioned a couple times an image on its own is not ultimately that useful because we need to take that image and actually get a running container. And so what we can do from here is we can say Docker run, and then we can give the name of the image. We're going to do hello world. And this will now run the hello world image as a container. And you can see all of this output. And if you see this hello Docker, then you did good. It worked. And so we now have a hello world container. So we have an image that's sitting there. We've now taken that image and made an instance of the container that's now, it ran and then it actually stopped. And so how do you know what containers that you have available? So I can come in and type docker ps, but let's see what we get here. Notice nothing shows up, which I know the first time I saw this was a little bit confusing because I knew I had a container because that's what the run command that we looked up here does. So what's going on? Well, docker ps, this command only shows the running containers. So how do we see all containers? Well, we do -a, and that will tell the Docker client ps command, I would like to list all containers, and there we go. So now we have the container ID, we have the image that was used for it, we have, well, it's kind of wrapping here. This is a sort of friendly name it comes up with if you don't want to refer to this guy. We created it about a minute ago, and the status is it's exited. So this particular container right now is not up and running because this container just outputs this log data you see up here, and then it kind of stops. So that's a really important little add-on to the ps command for a command line switch to do docker ps-a, because again, if you don't do that, you're not going to see it in this case. Now, that's not that useful of an image or a container, so how do we get rid of these now? That's great, we see it works, but now I'll probably never ever use it again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and say remove, and that's remove container. And then we have the container ID right here. And then we also have a little alias, but I just normally type the first few characters. So I'm going to do 59F. So we'll do 59F. I'm going to hit enter. Now when I do docker ps-a, you'll notice I don't have any containers left. So we deleted it. Now what about the images? Let me do a clear here. Well, let's do docker images again. Okay, it's still there. We deleted the container, but we didn't get rid of the image. So it's really similar to what we just did. It's Docker RMI. And then again, we can take the image ID and just do the first few. So in this one, since there's only one, I'm just going to do 0A. And there we go. It just deleted the layered file system for that particular image. So that's an example of how easy it is to use the Docker client command line tools to get started with pulling an image, viewing images, and then taking those images and converting them into running containers. So now that we've seen the basic commands for Docker client, let's pull down the Nginx image that I showed if you watched the Kitematic demo earlier in the course and see how we can get that actually running as well. So if we go back up to Docker Hub and go to Hello World, and I'll just kind of research on this. We'll hit enter there, and you'll notice that there's quite a bit of things we can do. There's a Tudum Hello World. There's also a Kitematic one down here. It looks like I'm not finding it immediately, so we could actually search for Kitematic. And there it is right there. So let's click on that. And just to save a little bit of typing, I'm going to go ahead and grab this pull command and just paste this again into my Docker client terminal that we have here. So we'll paste that in. And now this image will have a little bit more to it. It's bigger than the last one, so it'll take a moment to download, but it's pretty quick. And there we go. We have it. So there's Docker pull again. Now we can do Docker images. There it is. So there's our Kitematic. It's the latest. There's the unique ID it gives it, and it's about 6 months old, it looks like. So now we can actually start this image up and get it running. And to do that, we can again do Docker run and then give the actual name over here that we have of the image. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it in. Now, this particular image, though, has a port that we need to set. And so you can kind of think of it this way. The image is going to become a running container. Now, ultimately, what we have is a machine that hosts the container. Well, the machine has a port we're going to hit because you'll notice I already have an IP address up here typed for the machine. But we can also set the port that we're going to call on that machine. Now, when that gets called, it's then going to call into the appropriate container. In this case, the Nginx container, which is a reverse proxy type of tool. We can also set a port inside of the Nginx. Now, normally, Nginx is kind of a front-end server that'll serve up static files and forward more complex requests to back-end servers, ASP.NET, Node.js, and others. And so normally it's on port 80 if it's a kind of a public-facing website. So what I'm going to do is come into here, and we're going to use a command line switch on run. And I'm going to say that I would like to run this image, but I want to run it on port 80 for the machine. And that's going to forward internally to port 80 in the container itself. Now, this is a really important one because we need to set what is the port we're going to call on our actual machine, and then what's it going to call on this container that's going to get created based on this image. So let me go ahead and just hit return here, enter, and you'll notice this now started up my Nginx container in this case. It converted from the image into the container. So I'm going to come up here, and now if I hit the IP address for my machine, which is this 192.168.99.100, we should see an Nginx output here, and there we go. Now this looks very, very similar to what we saw earlier if you watch the Kitematic demo again, because it's the same exact image. It's just that we're now using the terminal here to actually work with this particular image and container. What I'm going to do from here is I can actually just start up a new kind of bash tab here. And I'm going to go into the Docker PS command that I showed you earlier. And you'll notice that right off the bat, because I didn't click on a quick start terminal, I get this cannot connect to Docker daemon. Now, one way around this is I can close it and just open up a different quick start. But let's go ahead and use what we learned earlier. I'm going to do Docker machine env, default is my machine. And then I'm going to run this eval command. All right, and this is the type of things you kind of need to know as you work with Docker. Okay, so now let me try Docker PS. All right, now it works. And you'll notice this command terminal is now tied to my default machine. And again, I didn't have to do that. I could have just clicked on the Docker Quick Start terminal here. But that's a nice little thing. So here we go. We have the container ID. Here's the image it's based on. There's a little start.sh script that's run. We started about a minute ago, and it looks like the status is up. It's wrapping a little bit there, but you'll notice status is up for about a minute or so, it looks like. Now we can come into here and we can say Docker stop, and then we can actually list just a few of the digits here. So I can just say Docker stop 10109. And now this is going to go in and try to stop that particular running container that we have going over in this tab right here. And so we'll let this run just for a sec. Okay, there we go. Now let's do Docker PS, and if it stopped, it shouldn't show it. All right, and it's empty. So now we'll do Docker PS-A, and there it is, but you'll notice that the status is exited. So that's how easy it is to pull that down. And then you now know how we can get rid of this as well. Once it's stopped, we can say Docker remove, and then give it that same container ID. So we'll just do 109, since that's a quick and easy way. Okay, so now Docker PSA, it's gone. Let's go to Docker images, and there's the image. Notice the, again, image ID here. So we can say Docker remove image 385, and that now deleted all the parts of the layered file system, and there we go. So now our container's gone, and our images are gone. And from a development standpoint, this is pretty awesome because now my machine is completely clean of this Nginx server. I don't have to worry about other files sticking around because I got rid of the actual image and the container. Now compare that to manually installing different servers and databases and things like that, and I think you'll find that that's a pretty compelling thing we can do in the development environment, because I don't know about you, I tend to like to keep my machine pretty clean. So that's an example of some of these different Docker client commands that we can actually run in a Mac environment. To get started using Docker client on Windows, we can first click the Quick Start Terminal and get our terminal window going. So I've already done that, and you can see I'm linked up to my default machine on the IP address that you'll see here. Now the first thing I'm going to do is show you some of the Docker client commands that we can run on the Windows side, and they're the same as in other places like on Mac. But if we just type Docker and hit enter, this will show us the list of commands we can run. And you can see there's quite a few. Now we're going to focus on the key commands that you need to know to get started with Docker client here. So we're going to be looking at some commands that you'll see down here like pull. We're going to look at rm, rmi, run, and stop, and a few others along the way here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run off to hub.docker.com. And I've already typed in this hello world image that I'd like to find that's up there, up in the cloud on Docker Hub. And so let's go ahead and find this, and you'll see the official hello world image. And this is a very basic image you can use to get started. So if we scroll on down, you'll see a description, some information about it. You'll see some example output of what we would expect if we run it as a container. And then over here to the right, you'll notice that I can run this command. That's a Docker client command called pull. Really simple to run. You simply say Docker pull and the name of the image. So I'm going to copy that, run on back here, and let's paste that into our terminal window. Hit return or enter, and this is going to pull down a layered file system. You'll see the pull is now complete, very fast because it's a very small image. And now we're kind of ready to go. So it pulled that image down to our local machine. Now how do I know that it actually worked? Well, we can come in and say Docker images. And this will list all the images that we have on the machine. And it looks right now that I have this hello world. It's the latest. Here's a unique image ID it assigns per image. It's created about 12 weeks ago, and it's really small, 960 bytes it looks like. Now from here we have an image, but images on their own aren't really that useful. They're like having a blueprint, but never creating a building. We want to create the building. We want to create the container that can do something. So now I can use the Docker client command called run, and I can say Docker run the name of the image that you'll see here, hello world. Hit enter there, and there we go. This is the actual container running. And so you can see hello from Docker. This message shows that apparently we're working. So we've done pretty good so far. We have a really, really simple image running, and they have some other info you can check out there if you'd like. That's not super impressive, obviously, but we do have a container. Now, is that container still running, or what happened there? So we can actually see all the running containers by doing Docker PS. And so I'm going to hit enter there, and you'll notice it's empty, which is a little bit weird because I do have a container, obviously it ran, but it must not be running. So if we want to list all the containers on the system, we can say docker ps-a, and that'll show all of them. So we'll hit return there, and there we go. So this is wrapping a little bit, so I'll make it a tad bit bigger. But you'll notice that we have a container ID, that's assigned per container. It's based on the hello world image. There's a command it runs internally, just hello. We created about a minute ago, and it exited about 55 seconds ago. Now it also gives it a little more friendly alias, if you will. And this particular alias is kind of something you can use instead of the alphanumeric characters you can see over here for the container ID. All right, so we've now run the container. We can see the container, but it exited. So this is a different container. This isn't one that you run the container and it stays up and running like a server. It just runs and then it just shuts down. So it's a very simple hello world type of example. All right, so let's get rid of this container then. We know it works, but we really don't need it anymore, and you'll probably never ever use it again. So we're going to do another Docker client command called remove, and this removes containers. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the container ID, but I really don't want to type all this. I know when I first started using Docker, I didn't realize that you don't have to type the entire container ID. So I went in and typed the whole thing though, but you don't need to. We can actually, in this case, we only have one, so I could get away with 24. I can get away with 2 if I wanted, but let's go ahead and do that. And you'll see it echoed back out, the container removed. Now let's make sure it worked. We'll do docker PSA again, and everything's gone, you'll notice. Okay, so the container's gone now. Now what about the image? Now the image is still there, and I probably don't need that on my system, so let's clean that off. And we can do that and remove it by doing docker rmi, remove image. And then just like we did with the container ID, there's an image ID here. So we only have one, so it's pretty simple. I'll just do like 0A. And now it just deleted that layered file system. Now if we go back and do docker images, you should see that it's completely gone. So now we've downloaded the image or pulled the image, we've run it, the container immediately stopped. We removed the container with the rm command, and now we just remove the image. So now there's really no trace of this on our system, and that's a great feature that we're going to talk more about in a moment with Docker in the development environment. So that's an example of how to get started with those commands. Now let's take a look at how we can pull a more robust image from Docker Hub and get that up and running on our machine. So if we go back over to the Docker Hub site, I can come in and search for Hello World, but for the Nginx. And if you saw the Kitematic demo earlier in the course, I'm going to do the same thing, but we're actually going to do it using the Docker client tool. So I'm going to come in and we'll just search for Kitematic, and we can just do hello-world here. Should pull it up. And there it is. So we can view some information about it. There's not a whole lot on this one, but it's a simple Nginx reverse proxy container. And you'll notice over here again, just like with the Hello World image, I can also pull the Kitematic Hello World Nginx image. So let me make sure I grab that whole command. And I'm just going to come on back and paste this in. So we'll paste in the docker pull command. And this one will have a little bit more. So this is going to pull down, again, the layered file system. You'll see this will start to fill in. It's still pretty fast. All right, so we're ready to go. So I'm going to do docker images. And there we go. We have the Kitematic Hello World Nginx, latest. There's the image ID again, and we can see the age and how big it is. So this one's a little bit bigger. Looks like about 8 meg or so. So the next thing I'm going to do is we have the image, and just like with the Hello World image, I want to go ahead and run this. So we would do the same thing. We would say docker run, and then we would put the image name. Now, because this is an actual server, it doesn't just write simple log output. There's a little bit more that we need to supply here. Now we have a Docker machine, and in fact that machine IP is shown right up here because I'm going to use it in just a moment. We saw that when I started the Quick Start terminal. And that machine needs to be told what port do you want to call to come into on the machine. And then we have to tell the machine, okay, well once you get on that port, we're going to do port 80. How does it call into the container, and what port does the container actually have? And I like to think of it as a bubble around the container, and on the outside of the bubble is the machine port, and then it's going to call a port that's the actual Nginx port that's in the bubble, or in the container, in other words. So let me show you how this works. It'll make a little more sense. So I'm going to say -p, and then we're going to do 80, and that's going to be the port for the machine, colon, And then that's going to say I want to forward from port 80 on the machine to port 80 in the container itself. Now, if we wanted to do maybe 5,000 on the actual machine, but 80 on Nginx, we could do that. But Nginx is typically used as a front-end type of reverse proxy server. It can serve up static files and then forward requests to more complex back-end servers like ASP.NET and Node.js and PHP and things like that. So we're going to do 80 to 80, and this will forward it. And we're going to say Docker run on this port on the machine and on the container, and then we have to put the name. So it's going to be Kitematic, Hello World, Nginx. All right, so now that we have that in place, we can go ahead and start up this Nginx server. So we'll go ahead and run that, and there we go. It looks like that container is now up and running. So what I'm going to do is leave that up, and I'm going to right-click here on our Quick Start terminal. I'm going to start a new terminal, and that'll link us up to the default machine again, and there's the IP address. And now let's see, what do we have as far as containers? So we're going to come in, and we're going to run the docker ps command. And it looks like we do indeed have a container, and you can see that it is up for about 23 seconds, up and running. There's the image it's based on, there's the container ID, and then here's the port forwarding I was talking about. So the IP here just is kind of generic, but this will be the machine IP :80 that forwards to port 80 in the actual container itself. Now that container is up and running, as you can see here, and it looks like when we started it up, we have this start.sh that the Nginx image actually had in it, and that actually started up the Nginx server. So I'm going to run over to this tab now, and we're going to try to refresh here. We're on port 80, so obviously I don't have to put, :80. We could, but I'm just going to hit enter, and there we go. So we now have on our development machine an Nginx container up and running. Very cool, because I didn't officially install anything from the Nginx site. We're just using, obviously, Docker images and containers here. So I'm going to run on back. Let's bring both of these back up. You'll notice that a request was made here. It shows the GET request was made. It was a successful 200 and some other information about the browser. And then if we come on back here, you can see that we're back where we were, and we can see that it's up and all that. So now what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and try to stop the container. So we'll go ahead and, not to confuse terminals here, let's go ahead and leave this one up. And I'm going to type docker stop, and then I'm going to take the container ID over here. Now, again, we don't have to type the whole thing. In this case, I can say, for instance, D7. And that's going to stop, using the Docker client tool, that particular running container. And this will take just a moment for it to stop. All right, so once it echoes back out the ID you typed, that pretty much means it stopped. So if we type docker ps, we shouldn't see it. And we don't, but if I do docker ps-a for all, we should see it, but you'll notice that now it says it's exited about 14 seconds ago. All right, great. So we now have a running container that we stopped. Now we've seen that because it stopped, we have to do the -a switch again to see it. And now let's go ahead and clean it up. Now this is one of the more exciting features, I think, from a development standpoint. Instead of installing a server on your physical machine, whatever it is, database server, web server, normally when you uninstall it, it seems like there's always a few files left over. But in this case, because we're using images and containers, we can use our normal Docker client commands, and I can say remove, give it that D7 container, and now if we do docker ps-a, you'll notice everything's gone for the container. So all right, that's great, but what about the image? Let's do Docker images. We still have the image. Now, normally, if you're going to be reusing this image to make other containers, you'd probably just leave it if we do it a lot. But in this case, let's just say, hey, I'm done with it. I really don't want it on my machine anymore. I've maybe tested something and everything's working great. Well, just like we did earlier, we can do remove image. And in this case, the image ID has this 385. So we'll go ahead and do that. That completely deletes that image. And now if we do Docker images, you can see we're clear, and Docker ps-a, of course, we're clear on containers. And this is pretty cool, I think. I'm a little bit picky on my development machines, and I like to keep everything really clean. And so when I'm done with something, I really would like all traces of it to be removed, and now it is. And I think this is a very, very cool feature for development that I literally can get, whether it's a database server, a server that's a reverse proxy like Nginx or others, up and running quickly on my machine without a lot of effort, just a few commands, and then I can completely remove all traces of it using these Docker client commands. So that's an example of some of the different Docker client commands that you can run on your Windows machine. Now that you've seen some of the different commands that can be run using Docker Toolbox tools, let's go ahead and do a quick review of some of the key commands so that we cement our knowledge and make it easier to remember them. So we started off by talking about Docker Machine and how it's all about interacting with machines that we might have. Now again, if you're on Windows or Mac, this will be VirtualBox machines. So we talked about commands like Docker Machine ls, and this will list the different machines that you have. If you want to start or stop a machine, you can simply say Docker Machine start or stop, and then give the machine name. In our case, the machine name was default. If you're wanting to set up the environment to link a terminal window into a machine, you can run Docker Machine environment. We talked quite a bit about that one. And then we showed some simple commands like Docker Machine IP in the machine name and Docker Machine status in the machine name. Now, as a quick review, the ls command will actually give you everything that IP and status will give you as far as the commands go, but ls shows all the machines, and if you did have a bunch of them, then you'd have to figure out which machine you're looking for. Whereas with Docker Machine IP or Docker Machine status, you can get that machine's info directly. Now, in addition to Docker Machine, we also talked about Docker Client. And Docker Client, of course, is all about images and containers. So some of the image commands we talked about were Docker Pull. We talked about Docker Images, lists all the images you have on your machine. And then we talked about how you can remove an image with Docker RMI, and you can give it the image ID that's available when you run Docker Images. Now, when it comes to container commands, we talked about Docker Run and the image name. And Docker Run, interestingly enough, will actually pull the image if it's not already found locally. So although technically you run Docker Pull first and then run Docker Run, if you want to save a step, you could actually run Docker Run and then give it the image name. And if it doesn't find it, it'll go download it, and then it will run that container. We also talked about how you can list the containers. Now, if you only want the running containers, you can do Docker PS. But if you want to see all of them, you would add -A to the end of that. And finally, we talked about Docker RM, which can be used to remove a container. So that's an example of some of the key commands that we've covered throughout this module, and I hope that helps cement them a little better in your mind. We'll be using them throughout the rest of the course, actually.